On December the 16th, 1997, a quantifiable percentage of Japan's youth sat down to engage in what had fast become a popular weekly ritual, watching an episode of the hit show Pokémon. However, partway through the episode, thousands of children had taken ill. Some were found convulsing in front of their televisions, their choice of poker plush firmly in hand, but others had passed out and were quickly taken to the hospital. This is the version of the story you're likely very familiar with if you spent any amount of time whatsoever on the interwebs or engaged with the Pokémon franchise in any way, shape, or form over the last 2 decades. But is this really what happened? Did a cartoon really cause hundreds upon hundreds of children to have spontaneous seizures? And if so, well, what the hell? To begin with, while we will likely never know exactly how many people were impacted by what came to be known simply as Pokémon shock, a very fitting name given what occurred, but we'll get to that in a moment, it is known that hundreds of children were indeed rushed to hospital, seemingly as a direct result of a thing that happened in the show. The numbers here tend to vary, but the commonly touted figure is about 700. More specifically, 685, and even more specifically still, 375 girls and 310 boys. With this figure widely being credited to a statement by Japan's Fire Defense Agency, except while many sources claim the Fire Defense Agency reported this, when we actually looked it up, the Fire Defense Agency actually noted that some 618 children were rushed to hospital with no additional clarification about the gender makeup of those affected. Then there are news reports from the time, which similarly quote officials with knowledge on the matter and claim around 500 children were affected, because precision apparently is a lost art. Further complicating matters is the fact that not all the children affected were rushed to the hospital, which has only served to muddy the waters of what actually happened. But more on that later, because we need to explain how all these children ended up in this situation in the first place. The cause of this bizarre moment in pop culture was episode 38 of the Pokémon anime, titled Dennō Senshi Porygon in Japanese, which roughly translates either to Cyber Soldier Paragon or Computer Warrior Paragon in English. In the episode, Satoshi, that's Ash in the English dub, and his friends have to stop the devious Team Rocket from stealing other people's Pokémon by going all Tron and having themselves digitized and uploaded into a computer, whereupon they encounter Paragon, an entirely digital Pokémon capable of existing inside cyberspace that also just so happens to look like a duck, because, well, why not? About 20 minutes into the episode, our heroes are imperiled when digital antivirus missiles are deployed. Just roll with it here. Said missiles are ultimately destroyed when franchise mascot Pikachu explodes them all via judicious use of the thunderbolts it can fire out of its own head. I mean, as you do. Now, this is by no means an unusual thing to happen in Pokémon. Most early episodes specifically end with Pikachu launching a bolt of lightning at something, and the common way this power was demonstrated was via the use of strobing lights. However, for this particular episode, the animators decided to get a little funky with it. Specifically, since the episode was set inside of a computer, it was decided that a regular old explosion just wouldn't fit. Thus, the decision was made to have the explosion realized not by a bright flash of light, but intermittent strobing flashes of red and blue. The thinking being that this would be reminiscent of the visuals of other media set inside of a computer or digital world like Tron. And it works, with the effect being employed several times throughout the episode without incidents, at least that we know of. But then, for the climax of the episode, the animators decided it would be a good idea to have this strobing effect persist on screen for 6 full seconds, with the screen rapidly flashing red and blue about 60 times in total within that span. Within minutes, Japanese emergency services were inundated with calls from panicked parents whose child had fallen ill, seemingly as a direct result of this moment in the show, which is where things once again start to get a little bit murky. You see, you're probably assuming at this point that the show must have caused said children to suffer an epileptic seizure, which no doubt was the case for some of them. Photosensitive epilepsy affects about 1 in 4,000 people, and given the popularity of Pokémon at the time, literally 70% of children surveyed in some regions of Japan watched the show with clockwork regularity, it's virtually guaranteed that some of them suffered from this condition, and the show had indeed triggered such a seizure. But a good number of the couple of hundred or so children rushed to hospital as a direct result of the show presented with decidedly unseizure-like symptoms. To be clear, the show absolutely caused some children to have a seizure, with at least 2 children being so badly affected they were hospitalized for 2 weeks before making a full and complete recovery. It's just that many hundreds, if not thousands more children, some sources cite the total number of children being affected as close to 11,000, didn't have seizures, but were still nonetheless incapacitated or reported feeling unwell, and we're still not entirely sure why. So, what happened to the rest of the kids? The most commonly touted hypothesis is that even if the majority of kids didn't suffer from a form of epilepsy that could be triggered by rapid flashing, the effect was still strong enough to prove disorientating and temporarily an issue to the still developing eyes of children who were too close to the TV at the time. That last part isn't us being facetious, by the way. Another compounding factor believed to have made the effects of the episode so widespread is the size of Japanese homes and propensity of children to sit extremely close to the TV as a result. Moving on, supporting this particular hypothesis is the fact that red and blue are noted as being particularly potent at triggering epilepsy, and that rapidly flashing lights are fully capable of making grown adults without epilepsy feel unwell. There's even a name for this, flicker vertigo, which itself is noted as causing some effects similar to those of an epileptic seizure in people who don't suffer from the condition. So it's likely that a lot of children were simply disorientated or made to feel nauseous by the extreme and sudden flashing lights, and their parents freaked out, as parents want to do when their little human parasites aren't wrapped up in bubble wrap and having every little need of theirs met, all while in perfect health. However, another explanation offered by experts is the sheer number of children impacted can be explained away by the absolutely fascinating phenomena of mass hysteria. As we've covered here many times before, humans are stupid, and our brains may talk good, but we monkey good too. For instance, as we have covered in depth before, at various points in history, dance mania has hit, wherein one extremely stressed individual snaps and begins frantically dancing, and it catches on, resulting in accounts in history of thousands of deaths of people literally dancing until they drop dead. While some conjecture these various dance plagues were caused by ergot and other such contaminants, the data nor descriptions fit that possibility in the general case. Mostly, it very much seems just like insanely stressed out people who snapped, and others seeing them snap and having certain pre-existing beliefs as to why, or went ahead and joined in, and it spiraled out of control thanks to the bizarre and surprisingly common phenomenon of mass hysteria. Briefly, one such dance plague in the early 16th century was following mass starvation, huge outbreaks of deadly diseases like syphilis and the like, resulting in one German woman known only as Trophea losing her Specifically, on July the 14th, 1518, Trophea stepped out of her home in Strasbourg, Alsace in France, near to the border of Germany, onto the cobbled street and started dancing despite the lack of any music or other apparent motivation. According to the famed Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus, also known as the father of toxicology, who chronicled this particular plague about 8 years later, the woman in question's husband apparently tried to get her to stop dancing, but she just kept on going. At some point that night, she finally collapsed from exhaustion, but it didn't end there. When she woke up the next day, she began frantically dancing again, despite her feet at this point being extremely swollen and bloodied. She continued in this way for somewhere between 4 and 6 days before the authorities had to transport her in a wagon to a shrine of St. Vitus some 30 miles away to try and cure her of her affliction, as it was deemed to have been caused by a curse by St. Vitus. This worked, and she was finally able to stop for good. Unfortunately, others seeing her do all this also began dancing hysterically shortly thereafter. The numbers began to swell, with hundreds more joining in on the self-destructive dancing. Ultimately, authorities decided it might not be a curse at all, but rather local physicians advised it was simply a case of hot blood. The normal solution would be to send those afflicted to a barber who would bleed them. However, given the number of people and their frantic dancing, it was deemed more practical to instead encourage the dancing. The cure, in this case, was to cool their hot blood with a good old-fashioned dance-a-thon. Thus, the town authorities ordered stages to be set up and people to dance on. To ensure that the dancing proceeded as vigorously as possible, they also hired local musicians to play continually day and night to try and accelerate the cure rate. More on this and more modern, equally bizarre instances of such mass hysteria and why these specific behaviors, they're in the bonus facts a little bit later. But now, let's go back to Pokémon. We're not saying that no child was genuinely impacted. There are official reports from emergency service personnel clarifying as much, but there's a pervasive and quite compelling hypothesis that a good number of children were convinced that they were ill, and their brains manifested that stress into physical symptoms, and as the word spread, it just snowballed from there. Which would explain why the reported symptoms from children who weren't known to suffer from a form of epilepsy are so disparate and hard to pin down. That's not to mention people get sick all the time, and it it being fully possible that the reported so-called thousands of children impacted who weren't ill enough to warrant a trip to the hospital simply felt unwell, and because humans have monkey brains, thinking correlation equals causation, they blamed the Pokémon episode as a result. Possibly supporting this hypothesis is the fact that while reporting the story, Japanese news not only explained the symptoms children were presenting with, but also inexplicably decided to show the unedited footage again. This naturally, whether for legitimate physiological symptoms or just psychological ones, caused a second wave of children to fall ill. Brilliant. And because kids, there are also reports some children simply faked symptoms to miss school, proving that even our little monkeys aren't completely stupid. But in all of this, to quote the Center for Inquiry on the matter, news of the mystery illness dominated Japan's news media the following day, and any students who hadn't heard about the scary news from their concerned parents or on the news certainly heard about it from their friends at school, and schools are amongst the most common places for mass hysteria outbreaks to occur. Once that happens, the number of kids reported to have been afflicted by the cartoon 2 days earlier skyrocketed to 12,000. The news media likely exaggerated the numbers, which created even more concern, and the panic snowballed. Again, monkey brain in a monkey brain. Humans are stupid, and that's why we should seek better leadership. For example, maybe we could have some sort of lizard overlords or some such. Regardless of exactly how many children were impacted, airing an episode of a show that puts a couple of hundred kids in the hospital is the sort of thing people want answers about, and in the days following the airing of Cyber Warrior Paragon, hit the fan. Among the first things to happen was that Nintendo immediately threw TV Tokyo under the bus in an attempt to distance themselves from the controversy, explaining in a press conference that they simply made the game the series was based on before additionally clarifying the game being in black and white meant something similar couldn't possibly happen with it. Their stock nonetheless dropped 5 points because panicking investors don't tend to read. But if we're talking public statements, none can top the one issued by then Japanese Prime Minister Ryotaro Hashimoto, who, whilst discussing the incident, went on a bizarre tangent about lasers and the dangers they pose to eyeballs, stating in part, rays and lasers have been considered for use as weapons. Their effects have not been fully determined. It has since been hypothesized that the Prime Minister had no idea what Pokémon was, and perhaps legitimately thought the show had fired a laser at children watching or something. We honestly have no idea what he was trying to say here, but we feel compelled to mention it because we are always down for discussing anything related to lasers. But back here on planet Earth, representatives from the National Police Agency visited the headquarters of the Pokémon Company and proceeded to poke and prod producers about what exactly had gone on in an effort to discern if they'd been negligent of their duties to safeguard their viewers. The police likewise paid a visit to broadcaster Television Tokyo for the same reason. Ultimately, no charges were filed, but TV Tokyo nonetheless decided to pull Pokémon from the airwaves until an internal investigation had been conducted. Because if there's one thing that's important to do in any newsworthy crisis, it's give the appearance of doing something helpful without really doing anything helpful at all. During the show's 4-month hiatus, producers hastily removed any similar moments and slapped together a generic warning for the start of episodes reminding viewers not to sit close to the TV and watch in a brightly lit room. In response to the whole affair, fans of the show held impromptu gatherings across Japan at which they'd sadly sing the show's iconic theme song. Fans also engaged in an extensive letter-writing campaign to bring the show back, and just an idea of how popular Pokémon was, some of the kids writing these letters were kids who'd been hospitalized by it weeks prior, with one young girl noting in her letter that while the episode had made her feel dizzy, she would almost certainly feel sad if she couldn't watch Pokémon anymore. A sentiment the author of this piece wholly agrees with, and the reader of this piece has no idea what he's talking about because he's never seen an episode of Pokémon. An oft-forgotten facet of this whole story was how poorly timed it was. As noted in Pokémon Story by Kenji Hatakeyama, for a time after, during the show's hiatus, bigwigs were majorly stressed about deals licensing the show to American networks. You see, they had only just announced their plans to do so about 3 weeks before the episode that got the entire show pulled from Japanese TV. To quote a translation of the book, some people say the incident actually helped Pokémon by raising its name recognition all over the world, but the truth is that it actually only increased people's reluctance to even bring it over in the first place. It was as if the high jump bar had suddenly been raised an additional 5 meters. In the end, these fears were misplaced, and American networks weren't really all that bothered, which was good, because for a brief time there were some executives who believed that the path to poker salvation lay in securing this deal, reasoning that doing so would strengthen the case for getting the show back on the air in Japan. Eventually, this wasn't necessary, but it did end up help the brand become the cultural juggernaut that it is today, and TV Tokyo were able to appease regulatory bodies and assured them that they wouldn't air another episode of the show that would risk detonating a child's eyeballs, metaphorically speaking. In addition to voluntarily adding the aforementioned disclaimer to the start of episodes and editing around moments where similar but not as jarring flashing effects were used, TV Tokyo agreed to new standards decided upon by experts for all of their animated offerings, the most obvious one being to limit any examples of flashing lights as much as possible. Other broadcasters similarly agreed and edited their content where appropriate to avoid anything similar happening in the future. But what about the episode itself? Well, it was of course immediately pulled from rotation and has never been aired again in any territory, even in an edited format. Clips of the offending scene, however, can be found online, though it is worth noting that all of the clips seem to be taken from the aforementioned news reports that decided it'd be a good idea to air the scene unedited a second time. Supposedly, the full episode does exist out there on the web, but only in its original Japanese form. Despite this, rumors persist that an English dub exists somewhere out there in the digital ether, though this seems unlikely given that, as previously mentioned, the deal to dub the show into English hadn't even been inked when the Seizure episode aired. Supporting this is an interview with Veronica Taylor, the voice of the main character Ash, in which, upon being asked about the infamous episode, responded simply, "We did not dub it. Oh, we will never dub it." Perhaps the biggest victim here, though, save for all of the kids we guess, is the titular digital duck the episode was meant to showcase, Paragon. You see, since Electric Soldier Paragon was pulled from rotation, the cyberized crane has basically never been seen again, with the Pokémon having virtually no further appearances in the show whatsoever, save for a blink-and-you'd-miss-it cameo where it's generally just in the background chilling. Whether this is a deliberate ploy on behalf of the Pokémon company to avoid potential references being made to the infamous episode bearing Paragon's name is unclear. There are a lot of Pokémon, 1,025 at the time of writing the script, so it's possible that there's just not been a reason to feature a Polygon or Waterfowl in an episode of the show. However, while we can't say for sure the Pokémon company is deliberately downplaying the digital duck, it would appear that they're at least hesitant to ever mention or call attention to the only episode of the show which it has a featuring role in. We say this because in 2020, the official Pokémon Twitter account, @Pokémon, tweeted simply, "Paragon did nothing wrong." An acknowledgement fans of the franchise celebrated, with much digital ink being dedicated to discussing how Paragon did in fact do nothing wrong. Remember, in the episode, it is franchise mascot Pikachu who prompted the flashes that caused the seizures, and a lot of tongue-in-cheek jokes about how perhaps Paragon had been used as a sort of escape duck to save Pikachu's reputation. But the point on this one is that the tweet was almost immediately deleted without explanation, leading many to assume that the famously family-friendly company drew the line about joking about that one time its shows put a bunch of kids in the hospital. And now for some bonus facts. Let's get back to the human brain being decidedly quirky and dance mania, shall we? While the idea of a bunch of medieval peasants covered in mud having a rave might sound hilarious and honestly like YouTube gold, the truth is a bit more sobering. For starters, the people would continue vigorously jumping or dancing about, or as stated in one account, they would rage like beasts over the land, seemingly in a trance day and night. Rah! It was also noted they sometimes would scream out or chant gibberish until completely exhausted, at which point they would collapse and some would die from cardiac arrest or injuries suffered from their violent dance. Those who didn't die once exhausted would reportedly sometimes twitch around on the ground, foaming at the mouth and gasping until they were able to once again get up and continue their dance. A bit more of a zombie horror film vibe than a fun Saturday night at the club, and unless you're into that, we guess. In addition, beside dancing, participants would also reportedly sometimes roll around in the dirt, squealing and acting like animals. Others would rip off their clothes and sometimes begin having sex with other Dance Mania participants. Some also would scream for people to beat the bottoms of their feet while they writhed around on the ground. Others would make crude or sexual gestures at those around them or threaten to attack spectators who refused to join in the hysterical dance. But once again, lest you think it's just our primitive medieval ancestors prone to such mass hysteria, here's some more modern examples. First, enter the 1962 Tanganyika laughter epidemic. For those unfamiliar, 3 girls began giggling and laughing apparently uncontrollably starting on January the 30th, 1962. Soon, this laughter spread throughout their school. This sounds innocent enough, except what's less often reported than the laughing is that people also began to weep, run, jump around, roll on the ground, faint, and generally show symptoms of extreme anxiety and just as extreme distress. After about 4 months of this occurring on and off, with as many as 60% of the students affected at one point or another, the school school was forced to close down for a time. It didn't stop there though, spreading to villages such as Nashamba and Bukoba. In the end, 14 schools had to be temporarily shut down, and an estimated 1,000 people, mostly school-aged children and among the poorest, were affected. Blood samples and other such tests were run, not finding any potential cause for the affliction, leading most to theorize it was one of many such examples of mass hysteria, at which point you might be wondering why this particular behavior. Well, going back to dance mania, however it first started, as alluded to in the region of Germany, particularly where dance manias most often popped up, people absolutely believed in being cursed like this, and this being the behavior that happens when you are. Thus, the general hypothesis is that during high-stress times, when everything in their lives was going wrong, they might feel like they were already cursed and then act out the pre-existing belief of what happens when you are cursed in this way, especially when others around you were already acting out the curse. It's also noteworthy for those joining in that there was also the belief that the one way to cure it was to dance it out. As an example of what can happen when a different belief is put in among people with a high amount of stress, with a great one of nuns from this era. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, there are numerous accounts of individual nuns and groups of nuns exhibiting bizarre behavior, like a 1491 event where a large group of nuns suddenly started acting like animals, including dogs, cats, and birds, screaming hysterically, convulsing, and acting extremely lewdly to the priests trying to exorcise the demons from them. Not only that, the nuns themselves would give their supposed demons names, like Ashcullen, dogs. Many of these events seem to have started with one or a small group of nuns under high stress, sometimes being investigated or punished for some behavior, or feeling like they'd committed major sins amidst spread talk. In pretty much all reported cases, their behavior was more or less textbook from what was expected to happen with people possessed by demons. In the case of the laughter epidemic, as noted by Professor Christian Hempelman of Texas A&M, quote, in 1962, Tanganyika had just won its independence. The young people involved reported that they were feeling stressed by the higher expectations of their teachers and parents. And again, it's also noteworthy that the majority of people affected seem to be among the poorest of the region, and in the case of the children, under the most pressure to do well academically. In this case, there doesn't seem to be any pre-existing belief in some sort of laughter curse or anything like that, but as with many cases of mass hysteria, it seems to sometimes just take a spark, and then people feeling the shared stress seem to mimic that behavior, even more so when the people themselves come to believe there is some sort of underlying outside cause, like a curse, or in modern times a microbe or something. Again, going back to Dr. Hempelman, he notes of many such cases of mass hysteria events, quote, now we call it mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. It's psychogenic, meaning it is all in the minds of the people who showed the symptoms. It's not caused by an element in the environment, like food poisoning or a toxin. There is an underlying shared stress factor in the population. It usually occurs in a group of people who don't have a lot of power. MPI is a last resort for people of a low status. It's an easy way for them to express that something is wrong. That may be why it has come to be associated more often with women, end quote. Going back to the nuns, these were often women who were sent to convents against their will, put under extreme stress to live perfectly moral lives, even in their own thoughts, and otherwise had very little power to change anything about their situation. And historically, it's perhaps not surprising that children and women were the most prone to this sort of mass hysteria, owing to both these groups throughout history often having little power or say in much of anything in their lives, which among the poor could often be extremely stressful. With no other outlet or way to change their situation, sometimes they just snapped under the load, and others with shared stress just joined in. Elements of this still happen occasionally today, as Dr. Hempelman notes, quoting again, it's more common than you think. It usually starts in a school or in a workplace. When people are in a stressful situation, they don't have the power to get out of that situation. This happened in Lafayette, Indiana a couple of years ago. They'll get someone to spray the area to comfort people who were involved. People involved will say that there were a bunch of bugs and we were stung by it. They won't admit that it was hysteria. The quote ends. In an older example of this, in February of 1787 at the cotton manufactory at Hodder Bridge in Lancashire, England, as reported by Dr. William Clare, who investigated the incident, quoting, a girl put a mouse into the breast of another girl who had a great dread of mice. The girl was immediately thrown into a fit and continued with it in the most violent convulsions for 24 hours. The next day, other women simply randomly started freaking out non-stop with no apparent cause. This continued with more and more people being afflicted, including at another factory not far away. Dr. Clare notes notes. By this time, the alarm was so great that the whole work, in which between 200 and 300 were employed, was totally stopped, and an idea prevailed that a particular disease had been introduced by a bag of cotton opened in the house. By the time Dr. Clare arrived, a few days after the initial event, he notes that 24 people had been afflicted, stating, of these, 21 were young women, 2 were girls of about 10 years of age, and 1 man who had been much fatigued with holding the girls. The symptoms were anxiety, strangulation, and very strong convulsions, and these were so violent as to last without any intermission from a quarter of an hour to 24 hours, and to require 2 persons to prevent the patients from tearing their hair and dashing their heads against the floor or walls." End quote. Being the late 18th century, Dr. Clare cured them all instantly with shock therapy, and then assured everyone that there was no plague or disease from the cotton, and those suffering were just afflicted with nothing more than anxiety. The mill was immediately reopened, and there were no further fits. A much more recent event occurred in 2011, when around a couple of dozen students at Leroy High School in New York, and later one adult whose friend's daughter was one of the afflicted, suddenly started having inexplicable issues with facial twitches and a number of Tourette's syndrome-like symptoms without being able to stop. Noteworthy here is that one of those afflicted actually did have Tourette's syndrome, which may have started the whole thing, as it was many of her friends and acquaintances who were first afflicted. Whatever the case, after examining the students, the doctors determined that it was most likely the students were really just stressed out, and it was all in their heads, even though they couldn't stop it consciously. They advised them to get off social media for a while and otherwise do things to reduce stress. Interestingly, the ones who followed the advice were miraculously cured shortly thereafter. Those who didn't, and some who even went on to talk shows and gave news interviews and the like, continued to be afflicted long after the others, though all were eventually cured. The one adult, Marjorie Fitzsimmons, also noted she'd been under a ton of stress, and once she dealt with that, her symptoms disappeared. As Dr. Hempelman noted before, people don't like to accept this psychological explanation. And many people among the public were skeptical about the doctors involved in the case's assessment. However, given they were all cured by more or less just reducing stress, one of the doctors at Dent Neurological Institute, Dr. Laszlo Merkler, summed up, "The vindication for us is that the patients are better. They've got their lives back."